I still remember the sound of the rain that night, heavier than anything Seattle had thrown at me before. It wasn't just weather. It felt like the sky was trying to drown me before I could make it out the door. The sharp tang of salt from the bay mixed with the metallic scent of the docks, and every drop that hit my skin felt like a warning I'd chosen to ignore for far too long. I ran, the soles of my shoes slapped against the wet concrete outside the event hall, where the so-called partnership signing was supposed to take place. That's what Victor Lang had called it, a partnership. As if shackling my art and my name to his empire for the rest of my life was some kind of opportunity. As if giving up every right to the murals I'd poured myself into was a fair trade for erasing the crushing debt he'd bought from the bank. He'd been smiling when I walked in. Not the kind of smile you'd return, the kind you'd step away from. A shark's smile, full of promises that meant nothing but trouble. And yet, for weeks, I had convinced myself I could survive it. For my mother's sake. For the hospital bills that stacked higher than I could ever hope to climb. But when the pen touched my fingers, I saw her face. Pale, exhausted, trying so hard to hide the pain when she thought I wasn't looking. And something inside me snapped. My hand didn't sign. My legs moved. And suddenly I was out in the rain, the paper still on the table behind me, his voice following me like a shadow I couldn't outrun. Maya! Even in the roar of the storm, his voice was clear, deep, commanding. The kind of voice that made people freeze in place. I didn't freeze. I pushed harder, weaving between parked cars lined up outside the hall, their glossy surfaces blurred by water and streetlight. My lungs burned, each breath slicing like glass. My heartbeat was a frantic drum, not keeping time with my feet but with my fear. He was close. I could feel it, the way you can feel a storm before you hear the thunder. The docks opened up in front of me, the world narrowing into the long stretch of pier lined with stacked shipping containers. The air was colder here, carrying the deep, low groan of ships shifting against their ropes. I ducked between two containers, hoping the shadows might swallow me, but the pounding of my pulse refused to quiet. I wasn't running just from Victor. I was running from the deal I had nearly made. The deal that would have taken the last thing I had left. My work, my name, the only pieces of myself I could still call my own. My hands were shaking, from cold, from fear, from the thought of my mother in that hospital bed wondering why I wasn't there. A splash of light cut across the wet asphalt. Headlights. Not from a car moving, but from one parked a few yards ahead. A black SUV, the kind with tinted windows and an engine that purred instead of roared. The rear door was slightly open, just enough for me to notice. Just enough for me to consider something insane. I hesitated for half a breath, glancing over my shoulder. A tall figure had stepped out from the side of the event hall, his suit jacket plastered to his frame by the rain. Even from here, I knew it was him. Victor. My chest tightened. I didn't think. I pulled the SUV's door open and slid inside, the smell of leather and some faint, clean cologne wrapping around me. My clothes dripped onto the floor mats. My heart slammed against my ribs like it wanted to escape. The world outside dimmed as the door clicked shut, the rain now just a muffled hiss against the glass. For a second, I let myself believe I had found a hiding place. Just for a second. Then I heard it. A man's voice, low and steady, from the driver's seat. Lock the door. You don't want him finding you this fast. For a moment, I didn't move. My hand hovered over the lock button, every instinct telling me I'd just made the kind of choice you regret for the rest of your life. I didn't know whose car this was. I didn't know if I'd just traded one predator for another. But the rain was still hammering the roof, and I could almost feel Victor's shadow stretching toward me from the dock. I pressed the button. The soft click of the lock sliding into place echoed louder than the storm in my ears. The man in the driver's seat didn't turn around. His profile was just a dark outline against the glow from the dashboard. Hands steady on the wheel, posture relaxed, as if having a stranger drip water all over his leather interior was something that happened every Tuesday night. "You're Maya Ellis," he said. My chest tightened. It wasn't a question. "How do you—" I started, my voice breaking somewhere between fear and disbelief. "Stay down," he cut in, his tone calm but carrying the weight of a command. I froze. There was no menace in his voice, no rush. If anything, it unnerved me more that he wasn't startled, like he'd been expecting me. Through the rain-streaked window, I saw movement. 2 men in dark coats moving between the rows of parked cars. Victor's men. They scanned windshields, their faces lit briefly by each flash of lightning. My pulse roared in my ears. I shrank lower into the seat, tucking my knees up, wishing I could make myself disappear. The SUV's engine was off, but the air inside was warm, carrying that clean scent I couldn't quite place. Something expensive, crisp, nothing like the stale damp of the docks. It should have been comforting. Instead, it made the whole moment feel unreal, like I'd stepped out of my own life and into someone else's. The man adjusted his rearview mirror slightly. I caught a glimpse of his eyes in the glass, cool, focused, scanning the men outside. His gaze shifted briefly to me. It wasn't curiosity. It was assessment. "They'll check every car if you stay here," I whispered. "They won't." "Check mine," he replied. And just like that, he leaned back slightly, as if this was nothing more than a passing inconvenience. One of the men outside passed so close to the SUV that the rain dripping from his coat sleeve streaked the window beside me. I held my breath, counting the seconds until his silhouette moved on. My legs ached from staying curled in the small space, but I didn't dare shift. "Why are you helping me?" I asked finally, my voice low. The man didn't answer right away. His eyes followed the last of Victor's men as they disappeared toward the far end of the lot. "Because you walked out on him," he said at last. "That tells me enough." My throat went dry. He knew Victor, knew what kind of man I'd just run from. And somehow, he'd known my name before I'd even spoken a word. I could feel the weight of his silence after that, as if he was waiting to see whether I'd stay or bolt the second the coast was clear. But my body had already made the decision for me. My muscles were still locked, my mind still replaying Victor's voice in the hall, the way the walls had seemed to close in around me. The man reached forward, started the engine. The deep, smooth hum filled the cabin, and for the first time all night I realized my hands had stopped shaking. It wasn't safety. Not really. But it was the closest I'd been to it in months. "Buckle up, Ms. Ellis," he said, shifting into gear. "We're leaving." I didn't ask where. The wipers swiped the rain from the windshield in long, measured arcs, like the car was breathing in slow motion. Outside, the docks blurred into dark streaks of steel and water. Inside, it was warm, too quiet except for the hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of the rain. He drove without speaking at first, his eyes fixed ahead, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel. I studied the lines of his face in the dim light, the sharp jaw, the kind of stillness that felt intentional, as if every breath was under his control. His suit was tailored, but not the kind worn for show. Functional, subtle. A watch on his wrist, dark metal, no brand I recognized, but it looked like it belonged to someone who valued precision. Finally, he glanced at me. "My name is Grant Holloway." The name didn't mean anything to me at first, but the way he said it, steady and unapologetic, made it clear he expected it might. I filed it away, waiting for the next piece. "You work with Victor?" I asked. A small, humorless smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Work with him? Number, that man's been trying to bury me for over a decade." I shifted in my seat, the seatbelt pressing across my chest. Then why? How do you even know who I am? His eyes flicked to me, then back to the road. I pay attention. And tonight, every set of eyes in that building saw a woman walk away from a deal no one else would dare refuse. That makes you interesting. The word interesting made me uneasy. Victor had found me interesting once, too, and that interest had nearly destroyed me. But Grant's tone was different. Less like he was claiming me, more like he was categorizing me, as if I'd just become part of some calculation running in his mind. You don't strike me as someone who helps strangers out of kindness, I said. You're right, he replied without hesitation. I'm not in this to play hero. He made a left turn, the tires whispering against the wet asphalt. The city lights softened into reflections on the hood, rippling with each bump in the road. What do you want from me? I asked. He let the question hang in the air for a moment, like he was measuring the exact weight of his answer. I want Victor Lang exposed for what he is, and to do that, I need someone with your eye. Someone who understands the kind of details most people overlook. I frowned. Details? Grant's gaze was back on the road, but his voice was sharper now, more focused. You've restored murals that were decades old. You can tell the age of a pigment by the way it settles in the cracks of plaster. You can see when something's been altered, even if it's invisible to everyone else. Victor forged a contract that cost my family everything. I've been chasing proof for years. A small chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the weather. I had imagined plenty of reasons why a man like him might pull me into his car, but this was too close to the skills I had spent my life perfecting. I leaned back against the seat, watching the raindrops streak sideways across the window. If you've been chasing proof for years, what makes you think I can find it? Grant's answer was quiet, almost conversational, but there was steel underneath. Because you walked away from him, that tells me you know when something doesn't feel right. And you don't ignore it. I didn't respond. The truth was, I didn't know if I'd walked away out of courage or panic. Maybe both. We drove in silence for another mile. The city started to peel away into quieter streets, lined with buildings whose windows glowed against the night. Grant's posture never changed. Calm, controlled, like he was the only one in the car who knew exactly where this was going. When he finally spoke again, his voice was softer. You don't have to trust me yet, Maya, but you will need me. The road curved toward the upper part of the city, where the buildings were taller, glassier, the kind that looked like they had their own weather systems inside. Grant slowed the SUV and pulled into a private underground garage. The gate rolled shut behind us with a metallic hum that sounded final. He parked near an elevator at the far end. For a second, he just sat there, one hand still resting on the wheel, his profile lit by the muted dashboard glow. Then he turned to me fully for the first time since I'd gotten in. I'm going to make you an offer, he said. His tone wasn't persuasive or desperate, it was matter of fact, like he was reading out the terms of a contract he already knew I'd sign. I don't remember saying I was in the market for offers, I replied, more defensive than I intended. You will be, he said, because right now you have two problems: Victor's debt hanging over your head and your mother's medical bills. I can erase both. Completely. The words hung in the air between us, heavy enough to make my breath catch. He didn't need to explain how he knew about my debts. If he could find my name and my history with Victor, he could find the rest. In exchange for what? I asked. Grant reached into the console between us and pulled out a sleek leather folder. He opened it and slid a single page toward me. The paper was thick, the kind used for important documents, or expensive lies. My eyes scanned the text. A contract. Names, dates, signatures. Victor Lang's signature. This is what ruined my family, he said. My father's shipyard was worth millions. That contract transferred every asset to Victor for a fraction of their value. I've had experts examine it for years. No one can find the flaw, but I believe it's there. And I believe you can see it. I felt my stomach knot. Why me? Because you've spent years restoring art, he said. You know how to find what isn't supposed to be seen. You've trained your eyes to catch imperfections. Paint over paint, pigment that doesn't belong, texture that tells a different story than the one on the surface. I looked down at the contract again. The ink was crisp, the lettering flawless. To anyone else, it would look like the real thing. But I'd learned a long time ago that perfection was often the first sign of a lie. And if I do this? If I find what you're looking for? I'll clear your debts, Grant said. Every cent. I'll pay the hospital in full, and I'll make sure Victor never comes near you or your mother again. The way he said it, steady, without hesitation, made it sound less like a promise and more like a certainty. Still, there was a part of me that couldn't stop circling back to the question I hadn't asked yet. What's in it for you? I said. Grant's eyes didn't waver. Justice, and maybe a little satisfaction. There was something about the way he said justice that made me think it wasn't the kind you could find in a courtroom. This was personal. Deeply so. I leaned back in my seat, my fingers tightening around the folder. It should have been an easy decision, a way out of a nightmare I hadn't been able to escape on my own. But deals, especially ones that sounded this clean, always came with costs you couldn't see up front. He didn't press me. He just sat there, watching me weigh the offer, as if he already knew which way I'd lean. Finally, I said, "All right, I'll look." Grant's expression didn't change much, but I caught it, a flicker of something in his eyes. Not relief, not gratitude, something sharper. "I'll take that as a yes," he said. "We start tomorrow." As I followed him toward the elevator, the folder clutched in my hands. I couldn't shake the thought that I'd just stepped out of one cage and into another. The elevator carried us higher than I'd expected. The numbers on the panel kept climbing, past the floors with company logos and reception desks, past the levels that smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner. When the doors finally opened, I stepped out into a space that didn't feel like it belonged in an office building at all. It was a wide, open room wrapped almost entirely in glass, the city spilling out in every direction. To the west, the lights of the port glimmered across Elliott Bay, the cranes rising like skeletal sentinels against the night. Rain streaked down the glass, catching the reflections of cargo ships and the distant ferries crawling toward the islands. Even through the glass, I could hear the faint groan of the wind rolling off the water. "This is where you work?" I asked. Grant stepped out beside me, his presence steady, unhurried. "It's where I find answers." The center of the room was dominated by a long steel table, bare except for a few stacks of files and a small array of equipment that looked like it belonged in a lab more than an office. There was a flatbed scanner large enough to hold a newspaper, a digital microscope with multiple lenses, and a light box that gave off a clean white glow. Against one wall, a row of cabinets was labeled with dates and project names I didn't recognize. I walked toward the glass, letting my fingertips brush the cold surface. From here, the rain looked softer, almost delicate, though I knew it was still coming down hard enough to soak anyone unlucky enough to be outside. Grant set his leather folder on the table and opened it. "This is the original," he said, sliding the contract toward the light box. The glow beneath it made every fiber in the paper visible, every stroke of ink stand out in sharp relief. I stepped closer, leaning over it. The paper was thick, textured, the kind I'd handled before when working on early 20th century posters. The ink was a deep black, uniform in tone, without the faint fading or feathering you'd expect from a pen of that era. At first glance, it was perfect. Too perfect. You've had other people look at it, I said. Some of the best, Grant replied. Lawyers, forensic document examiners, even a couple of historians. They all came back with the same answer: authentic. I bent closer, my eyes adjusting to the light. I could see the slight indentations where the pen had pressed into the page, the micro variations in the signature. If this was a forgery, it wasn't done by an amateur. Do you have the pen that signed this? I asked. Grant shook his head. Number. If Victor ever had it, he didn't keep it where I could find it. He crossed to one of the cabinets, unlocked it, and pulled out a small metal case. Inside was a set of fine point brushes, cotton swabs, and a bottle of reagent solution I recognized from my restoration work. It was used to detect certain chemical compounds in inks and pigments. He set it on the table beside the light box. You'll have everything you need, he said. Microscope, high-resolution imaging, chemical analysis. If there's a flaw in this contract, we're going to find it. I glanced up at him. And if we don't? His eyes met mine without flinching. Then I've wasted more than a decade chasing a ghost. The way he said it told me he wasn't prepared to accept that outcome. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I turned back to the table, letting my hands rest on the cool steel. The view of the bay was still in the corner of my eye, a constant reminder of where I was and what I'd agreed to. The storm outside showed no sign of letting up, and neither, I suspected, would Grant Holloway. All right, I said, pulling the contract toward me. Let's see what's hiding in plain sight. I was about to sit down at the light box when something on the far wall caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just another framed photograph. This room was full of them, quiet pieces of someone's history. But when I stepped closer, I realized it was a mural fragment. The paint was cracked in spiderweb patterns, the colors muted by time but still alive in places where the original pigment had clung stubbornly to the plaster. The scene was of the waterfront, old fishing boats bobbing against the dock, gulls wheeling in a sky that had once been a brighter blue. Even under the weight of years, the brushstrokes carried a sure, confident hand. You've seen it before. Grant's voice came from behind me. He hadn't moved closer, but he was watching. I don't think so, I said. It was part of a larger piece. My father painted it for the workers' hall at the shipyard. After Victor took the place, the hall was gutted. I managed to save this section before the rest was lost. I looked at it again, this time with the knowledge that it was personal. It wasn't just paint on plaster. It was a piece of someone's life. It's beautiful, I said quietly. His eyes shifted to the contract on the table. That's what Victor does. He takes what's worth keeping and destroys the rest. I turned back to the light box, the weight of his words settling over me. If this contract was what he claimed, then it wasn't just a legal document. It was the wreckage of an entire life, the way this mural fragment was the wreckage of something whole. I began with the basics. Under the microscope, the ink revealed itself in crisp lines, no signs of pooling or feathering that would betray a later edition. I adjusted the focus, scanning for inconsistencies in the pressure of the pen, subtle tremors that might suggest a forged signature. Nothing. Next, I held the paper at a low angle against the light box, letting the illumination catch any indentations from writing instruments. Sometimes, the ghost of a different document would appear, impressions left from a sheet above or below. But the fibers lay flat and undisturbed, as if this contract had lived its entire life in a vacuum. I moved on to the chemical test. A small drop of reagent on the edge of the signature should have revealed changes in the ink's composition over time, but the reaction was exactly what you'd expect from a document of its alleged age. If Victor had faked this, he'd done it with materials and methods far beyond the reach of most forgers. 2 hours passed like this, methodically checking, rechecking, running tests I'd used 100 times before. Each result came back clean, Too clean. Every answer led me back to the same place: authenticity. I leaned back in the chair, rubbing at my temples. The storm outside was still pressing sheets of rain against the glass, the sound a steady, relentless backdrop to my frustration. Grant stood at the window, his hands in his pockets, watching the bay as if the answers might surface there instead of on the table between us. "Anything?" he asked without turning. "Not yet," I admitted. "If this is a forgery, it's flawless, which doesn't make sense." He glanced over his shoulder. "It makes sense if you assume it's real." I met his gaze. "Do you believe that?" His jaw tightened just slightly, enough for me to notice. "I believe Victor Lang doesn't deal in honest paper." I turned back to the contract, the white glow of the lightbox making the ink seem almost too black. Somewhere in there, if Grant was right, was a flaw. But if I couldn't see it, then maybe I wasn't the person he thought I was. And if I wasn't, what then? The thought settled in my stomach like a stone. I pushed it aside and picked up the magnifier again. There was no room for doubt. Not yet. The days blurred together after that. I couldn't tell if it had been 3 or 5 or 7. The only constants were the hum of the microscope, the steady glow of the lightbox, and the rain outside. Sometimes a mist, sometimes a storm, but never entirely gone. Morning light meant nothing in Grant's glass-walled research room. The city's rhythm was muted up here, replaced by the quiet patience of the bay and the endless repetition of my work. I examined the contract again and again, breaking it down into sections, looking for inconsistencies I might have missed in the first pass. The more time I spent with it, the more it seemed to resist me. The paper didn't betray its secrets under angled light. The ink held firm against chemical tests. Even the minute texture of the fibers, often the giveaway for a counterfeit, was unremarkable, as if it had nothing to hide. At night, I stayed in the small guest room Grant had arranged for me in the building. The space was clean, quiet, furnished in a way that made it impossible to tell whether anyone had ever lived there before. I'd lie in bed with my eyes closed and see the contract behind my eyelids. The strokes of the signature burned into my mind like an afterimage. Sleep never lasted long. I'd wake in the dark, convinced I'd overlooked something, and find myself back in the lab before sunrise. The physical fatigue was one thing, but it was the weight of expectation that pressed down hardest. Every time I caught Grant watching me from across the room, I could feel the unspoken question in his gaze. "Have you found it yet?" I told myself it was my own imagination, but the silence between us seemed to grow heavier each day. I tried to remind myself why I was here: my mother's hospital room, the bills piling up like a slow-moving avalanche, but the thought that had once fueled me began to twist. If I failed, not only would I lose the chance to help her, but I'd have wasted what little time she had waiting for an answer I couldn't deliver. By the 4th or 5th day, whatever it was, I'd started to doubt more than the document. I doubted my skill, my instincts. The years I'd spent training my eyes to catch the faintest irregularity in a century-old mural seemed useless in the face of this pristine, mocking page. One evening, when the city outside was nothing but blurred lights through the rain, I caught myself staring at the fragment of Grant's father's mural instead of the contract. The boats, the dock, the pale blue sky, they were cracked and worn, the flaws visible and honest. I realized I missed that kind of truth, even if it was messy and imperfect. This contract was the opposite. It was a wall with no cracks, no loose bricks to pry at, and I was starting to feel like I was the one trapped behind it. Grant didn't push. He came and went on his own schedule, sometimes gone for hours, sometimes standing at the window while I worked, saying nothing. His restraint should have made it easier, but in a way, it only made the pressure worse. It meant he was waiting for me to be ready before he demanded answers. I began to wonder if I'd been wrong to agree. Maybe I wasn't the person he needed. Maybe I'd stepped into a fight I couldn't win, against a man I'd barely escaped from in the first place. One night, close to midnight, I caught my reflection in the glass wall. Hair pulled back messily, dark circles under my eyes, shoulders hunched as if I'd been carrying something heavy for too long. I barely recognized myself. That was when I realized the truth. I wasn't just chasing a flaw in the paper. I was chasing a way to prove, to him and to myself, that I was still worth something. It was close to midnight when I finally pushed the microscope away and admitted I was getting nowhere. The rain outside had thickened into a curtain, streaking the glass walls and blurring the lights of the bay. I was rubbing the ache out of my neck when Grant appeared in the doorway. "Come with me," he said. It wasn't a question. I hesitated only long enough to grab my jacket. We rode the elevator down in silence, the hum of the machinery filling the space between us. Instead of heading for the street, he led me through a side corridor that opened onto a private dock. A sleek motor yacht sat moored there, its hull dark against the restless water. "Is this yours?" I asked, my voice low against the sound of the rain. He stepped aboard, offering a hand to help me across the gap. "It's where I think," he said simply. The deck was slick under my boots, the air heavy with the briny scent of the bay. We moved toward the bow, the city behind us, the black water ahead. The rain wasn't gentle. It stung against my cheeks, but it also felt clearing, in a way. Like it was washing away the stale air I'd been breathing in that glass room for days. Grant leaned against the railing, his gaze fixed on the shifting dark of the horizon. "You've been looking at that contract for a week straight," he said, "and every time I walk in, you're in closer, tighter, like you're trying to crawl inside the ink." I felt a flicker of defensiveness. "That's how you find the flaws. You go detail by detail until something doesn't fit." "Maybe," he said, "but sometimes the detail is the trap." I frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" He finally looked at me, rain running down the sharp planes of his face. "When my father painted a mural, he didn't start with the eyes or the hands. He started with the wall. He made sure the surface told the right story before he added a single stroke. If the wall wasn't right, nothing he painted on it ever would be." The wind whipped between us, rattling the ropes that tethered the boat to the dock. I thought about the fragment of his father's mural upstairs, the texture of the plaster, the way the cracks followed the shape of the scene. It wasn't just the image that mattered. It was what held it up. "You're saying I've been staring at the eyes when I should be looking at the wall," I said slowly. "I'm saying you might be looking in the wrong place entirely," he replied. I let that sink in. My training had always been about isolating the smallest possible detail, a flake of paint, a half-millimeter shift in pigment tone. But maybe this wasn't about the smallest piece. Maybe it was about the frame that held the whole thing together. The circumstances, the context, the parts no one thought to question because they weren't on the page. For the first time in days, my mind felt open. A new set of possibilities flickered to life. Grant straightened, pushing away from the railing. "Tomorrow, start over. Pretend you've never seen that page before. Don't just study the signature or the ink. Study the world it was born into." The rain had soaked through my jacket, but I barely noticed. Something in me had shifted, like a locked door clicking open. As we stepped back onto the dock, I glanced at him. "Why tell me this now?" His expression was unreadable in the shadows. "Because you're running out of time, and so am I." The elevator ride back up was just as quiet as the one down, but the silence felt different. Less like defeat, more like anticipation. When I closed my eyes that night, I didn't see the neat lines of the contract anymore. I saw the wall behind it, and I knew I had to start chipping away. The next morning, I walked into the research room and didn't go near the light box. The contract lay where I'd left it, its crisp edges almost haunting me, but I ignored it. Instead, I sat at the desk near the window with my laptop and a stack of old shipping ledgers Grant had pulled from storage. If I was going to look at the wall, as Grant had put it, I needed to understand the world the contract came from. What else was happening in the city on the day it was signed? What was in port? Who was doing business? What was moving through the docks? And when? I started with the date, August 14th, 11 years ago. The weather records were easy to find. Clear skies, light wind, unseasonably warm for Seattle. That alone meant nothing. But then I dug into the maritime news archives, the ones most people wouldn't think to search. The harbor logs showed which ships were docked that week, what cargo they carried, and where it came from. I traced each manifest like a thread, mapping out the flow of goods into the city. Most of it was routine: machinery, timber, seafood shipments, the occasional specialized freight. Hours passed. I drank coffee that had gone cold twice over. My eyes were starting to ache when I found it. In the weekly bulletin for the Pacific Northwest shipping industry. A small note, tucked between announcements about ferry maintenance schedules and harbor safety drills. First shipment of Xenon Blue Ink base, scheduled to arrive from Osaka next month. Distribution expected to begin domestically by late September. I read it twice, then a third time, my mind already sprinting ahead. Xenon Blue was a specialized ink, expensive, imported in limited quantities, used for high-end printing and certain security documents. The same deep, almost luminous blue that appeared in Victor's signature on the contract. If the shipment hadn't arrived until a month after the contract was supposedly signed, then the ink in that signature couldn't have existed in Seattle on that date. I felt the rush before I'd even finished the thought. My fingers itched to get the contract back under the microscope, to compare the hue against a sample. This was the first crack in the wall I'd seen, and it wasn't even in the paper. It was in time itself. Grant came in while I was still staring at the bulletin on the screen. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. "Not a ghost," I replied. "A shipping delay." He walked over, glancing at the document on my laptop. His eyes narrowed. "Xenon Blue." I nodded. "Imported from Osaka. First shipment landed in the U.S. a month after this contract was dated. Which means Victor's signature couldn't have been made with that ink on the day the contract claims." He finished for me. I couldn't help but smile. The first real one in days. "Exactly." He stood there for a moment, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was satisfaction in it, yes, but something else too. Maybe relief, maybe respect. "This is good," he said finally. "But it's not enough. We need proof the ink matches." "I can get that," I said. "But this changes everything. We don't just have to prove the document's a fake. We can prove it couldn't possibly have existed when it claims to." The rain had stopped outside, leaving the bay a flat, steel-gray mirror. For the first time, the city beyond the glass felt less like a cage and more like a stage. I slid the contract back under the microscope, my pulse quickening like I was about to step into a spotlight. The Xenon Blue shipment note was still open on my laptop beside me, the date circled in red. Now, I just needed the physical proof to tie it all together. Under magnification, the ink in Victor's signature revealed itself in shades that no naked eye could distinguish. I switched to the spectral analysis attachment, the one that translated pigment into a color graph. The peaks and valleys on the display were sharp and unmistakable. This wasn't just any blue. It was the dense, saturated curve of Xenon Blue. Grant leaned over the table, his hands braced on the edge as he studied the monitor. "Run it against a control," he said. I'd already prepared a small swatch card, a test sample of Xenon Blue from a batch dated 2 years ago. Under the same analysis, the graphs aligned like a fingerprint match. Every peak, every dip, perfectly mirrored. I exhaled, almost laughing from the sheer relief of it. It's the same pigment. No question. Grant didn't move for a second, just watching the two graphs side by side. Then, for the first time since I'd met him, I saw the corners of his mouth lift. Just slightly, but enough to change his whole face. The hard lines softened, the control in his expression giving way to something warmer. "You found it," he said quietly. Hearing those words felt like shaking off a weight I didn't realize I'd been carrying. For days, I'd been grinding myself down, wondering if I was chasing a ghost. Now I had the flaw, and it was hiding in plain sight, just like Grant had told me. I sat back, letting the satisfaction sink in. With this, any decent expert could confirm the document's a forgery. He straightened, the faint smile already fading into his usual composure. "Yes, but having proof isn't the same as winning." I looked up at him. "What do you mean?" He began pacing slowly, his gaze shifting between the mural fragment on the wall and the contract under the light. "If we release this now, Victor will bury it under 100 counterclaims. He'll hire experts to muddy the waters, create just enough doubt to make it meaningless. He's done it before." "So when?" I asked. "On his stage," Grant said. "At a time and place where he can't spin it away. Somewhere the audience isn't just lawyers, it's the people he needs to impress, the ones who can turn their backs on him." I thought of the gala invitations I'd seen stacked in his office, embossed with gold lettering and the logo of the Port Authority. The fundraiser. Grant nodded once. 2 weeks. He'll be there, smiling for the cameras, talking about community investment. And you'll be there too. It was only then that I realized he wasn't just talking about showing the proof. He was talking about making it a spectacle. Victor's own image, undone in front of the very people who kept him powerful. The idea made my stomach twist. Not from fear exactly, but from the knowledge that this wasn't going to be a clean surgical strike. It was going to be public, messy, unforgettable. Grant looked back at the graphs on the screen. "Until then, this stays between us. No one else can know." I nodded, though a part of me itched to march straight into the nearest newsroom with the evidence. But he was right. Victor was too practiced at surviving quiet attacks. This would have to be loud. As I shut down the analysis equipment, I caught my reflection in the glass wall again. This time, I didn't see the exhaustion that had haunted me a week ago. I saw focus, purpose. And for the first time, I felt ready for whatever came next. The plan took shape in Grant's office, the one floor above the research room, where the view of the bay stretched like an open invitation. The storm had finally broken, sunlight spilling across the water in sharp, clean lines. It was the first clear day I'd seen since arriving, and it made the room feel almost unreal, too bright for the conversation we were having. He stood at the head of the table, a stack of folders neatly arranged beside him. "The Port Authority Gala is invitation only," he began. "Every board member, major investor, and shipping magnate will be there. Victor will be the star of the night." I sat across from him, arms folded. "And we're going to crash it?" "Not exactly." A small curve of a smile touched his lips. "We're going to buy our way in. The event is also a fundraiser. I've arranged a contribution large enough to secure a speaking slot. That's how we get on stage." I thought about the people who would be in that room. Polished, powerful, most of them loyal to Victor because it benefited them. The idea of standing under their gaze made my stomach tighten. "And when we're up there, you want me to—" "What? Give a lecture on pigment analysis?" "Not a lecture," he said, sliding a folder toward me. Inside was a mock-up of a presentation, images of the contract under magnification, side-by-side comparisons with the xenon blue sample, the shipping manifest highlighting the date of arrival. "You'll walk them through it. Simple, clear, undeniable." You make it sound like they'll all just believe me, I said. They will when it's public enough that they can't afford not to, Grant replied. Victor's entire image depends on trust. If we break that in front of the right audience, he can't repair it. We spent the next 2 hours mapping out every step, how we'd time the reveal so the room couldn't recover before the night ended, which images would hit hardest, even the order of slides. Grant was meticulous, questioning every transition, every choice of wording. It wasn't just about proving Victor wrong, it was about controlling the moment so completely that he couldn't slip free. When the outline was finally solid, Grant walked to a wardrobe in the corner of the office. He opened it to reveal a row of garments covered in clear protective bags. Without a word, he slid one out and held it toward me. It was a dress. A deep, almost iridescent shade of blue, the kind that shifted subtly in the light. The fabric felt cool under my fingertips, smooth but heavy enough to hold its shape. Why do I get the feeling this isn't a coincidence? I asked. It's not, he said. That shade will pick up under the stage lights. It'll make you the focal point before you even speak. I hesitated, looking at the dress and then at him. You really think that matters? Everything matters, he said simply. Later, alone in the small guest room, I slipped the dress on. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for me. When I turned toward the mirror, I barely recognized the woman looking back. The lines of exhaustion around my eyes seemed softer, my posture straighter. The dress didn't change who I was, but it made me see what I could be. Someone who didn't just survive the night, but owned it. For months, I'd been running. From debt, from Victor, from choices I'd made out of desperation. Now, for the first time, I was walking toward something. And I wasn't sure if that terrified me or thrilled me more. I stood there longer than I meant to, the city's evening light falling across the glass, my reflection caught between shadow and gold. The next time I faced Victor Lang, it wouldn't be as the woman who ran from his deal. It would be as the woman who ended it. The night of the gala arrived with a cold wind off the bay, the kind that made the lights of the waterfront shimmer harder against the dark. From the curb, the Port Authority Hall looked like a palace of glass and steel, its facade glowing in warm amber tones. Cars lined up in front, their doors opening to spill out tuxedos, gowns, and practice smiles. Grant's SUV slid into place, and before I could gather my breath, a valet opened my door. The moment my heels touched the pavement, the sound of the city dimmed beneath the low hum of conversation and the swell of music leaking from the hall. My dress caught the light exactly the way Grant said it would, tiny glints of blue shifting with each step. I could feel eyes on me, the way people glance at someone they can't place, but are certain they should know. Grant walked beside me, crisp black suit, posture like he belonged in every room he entered. He didn't touch me, didn't guide me, but somehow I still felt tethered to his presence, anchored by it. Inside, the air was warm and heavy with the scent of polished wood and expensive wine. A crystal chandelier spilled light across the marble floor, refracting into 100 shards that danced over the guests. Servers wove through the crowd with silver trays, the clink of glassware blending with the soft notes of a string quartet tucked near the far wall. We moved slowly, Grant greeting a few faces with polite nods, ignoring others entirely. I noticed how conversation shifted when we passed, voices dropping, eyes following. It wasn't just him drawing attention, it was the fact that we were together, and no one here knew why. Near the center of the room, under a banner with the Port Authority's crest, stood Victor Lang. Even at a distance, his presence was magnetic in a way that made my skin crawl. His tuxedo was perfectly cut, his hair silvering at the temples just enough to suggest experience without weakness. He was laughing at something a man beside him had said, but when his gaze found us, the laughter stopped. For a moment, we just looked at each other across the crowd, His eyes narrowed, not in confusion, but in calculation. Then he began to move toward us, slipping between guests with the ease of someone who owned the room. "Grant Holloway," he said when he reached us, his voice carrying just enough warmth to sound civil. "It's been too long." "Not long enough," Grant replied, his tone even. Victor's gaze shifted to me. He didn't offer his hand. "And you must be Maya Ellis." Hearing my name from his lips made the air feel heavier. "We've met," I said, my voice steady despite the tightness in my chest. A slow smile spread across his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Briefly, yes. I didn't expect to see you here tonight." "I'm full of surprises," I said. He glanced between us, something sharp flickering behind his expression. "I'm sure you are." Then, turning to Grant, he added, "Enjoy the evening. I hear the program is quite enlightening this year." With that, he moved on, his departure as deliberate as his arrival. The crowd seemed to close behind him, but the echo of his words lingered like a challenge. Grant leaned slightly toward me. "He knows something's coming." "Good," I said, keeping my eyes on the stage at the far end of the hall. "Let him think he's ready." The lights dimmed slightly, a signal that the formal program was about to begin. Around us, guests drifted toward the tables, their voices lowering to a murmur. I could feel the rhythm of the night shifting, drawing us toward the moment we'd been planning for. Grant's hand brushed lightly against my arm as we started toward our seats. "Stay sharp," he said. I didn't need the reminder. Every step felt like it was carrying me closer to the point of no return. The program moved quickly through the formalities. Opening remarks from the Port Authority chair, a brief speech from a shipping magnate whose voice droned like the engines of an old ferry, polite applause for a string of donors. I barely heard any of it. My pulse was in my ears, steady but insistent, like it was keeping time for something about to break. Then I heard Grant's name. The host called him to the stage with the kind of respect reserved for people whose checks had more zeros than anyone else's. Grant rose without hesitation, buttoning his jacket as he moved toward the steps. His stride was calm, deliberate, every inch the man in control. When he reached the podium, he spoke with an ease that made the room lean in. "It's a privilege to be here tonight," he began, his voice carrying without strain. "The work the Port Authority does for this city matters, to its economy, to its people, and to the integrity of how we do business." I saw Victor in the crowd, seated 2 tables from the front. His smile was still in place, but his fingers drummed lightly on the tablecloth. He knew something was coming. He just didn't know what shape it would take. Grant's tone shifted. "But integrity," he said, "isn't a given. It's something we protect. And sometimes, it's something we have to fight for." He turned slightly, gesturing toward me. "Tonight, I want to share the stage with someone whose skill and courage have brought a truth to light. Ms. Maya Ellis." The sound of my own name seemed to push me forward. I rose, the soft rustle of my dress almost lost under the polite applause. The lights were hotter on stage than I'd expected, making the sea of faces below blur into a single, shifting mass. I found the remote for the presentation in my hand, the first slide glowing on the screen behind me. "Good evening," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. I was asked to examine a contract, one that transferred ownership of the Holloway shipyard to Victor Lang. My task was to determine if it was authentic. The slide changed to an image of the contract under magnification, the neat strokes of Victor's signature magnified until the ink's texture was visible. At first glance, every test said it was real, but when I looked beyond the ink, when I looked at the world around the date this was signed, I found something. A new slide, the shipping bulletin from 11 years ago, the note about xenon blue circled in red. This pigment, xenon blue, is rare. It was first imported into the US a month after the contract's date, but Victor's signature was written with it. I clicked again, and the graphs appeared, 2 sets of peaks and valleys, one from the contract, one from the control sample. They matched perfectly. This is spectral analysis, I explained. It shows the chemical fingerprint of the ink. These 2 graphs are identical, which means the signature on this contract could not have been made on the day it claims. The room had gone quiet. No shuffling, no murmured side comments, just the heavy attention of a crowd trying to process what they'd just been shown. Somewhere in the back, a camera shutter clicked. I let the silence sit for a moment before finishing. Forgery isn't just about making something look real. It's about hiding the lie so well that no one thinks to question it. But once you know where to look, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. I lowered the remote. The final slide froze behind me. The signature, the graphs, the date of the ink's arrival. Side by side, unmistakable. When I glanced toward Victor, his smile was gone. The silence in the hall didn't last. It shattered like glass under a sudden weight. Murmurs rippled through the tables, first in cautious tones, then louder. Sharp edges of disbelief, outrage and curiosity threading together until the air itself seemed to vibrate. People leaned toward each other, pointing at the screen, at me, at Grant. Phones appeared in hands, snapping photos, recording video. I heard Victor's voice rise above the noise. "This is absurd," he said, his tone forced into something between a laugh and a snarl. He was on his feet now, straightening his jacket, scanning the crowd for support. "Anyone can manipulate a slide deck. This is nothing but a stunt." Grant stepped forward, calm as ever. "Then you won't mind if the contract is examined by an independent panel, selected by the Port Authority, under full public oversight." The suggestion landed like a hammer. Heads turned toward Victor, waiting for his answer. His jaw worked, but no words came. The silence around him was different now. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of distance. Even the people at his own table seemed to lean away, their eyes flicking elsewhere. Victor tried again, his voice sharper this time. This is an ambush. It won't hold up." 2 men in dark suits appeared at the edge of the stage, event security, moving with that quiet, decisive efficiency that draws more attention than it deflects. One approached Grant, the other me. "Mr. Holloway, Ms. Ellis," the taller one said, his voice low but firm. "We'll escort you out. For your safety." Grant nodded once. "Let's go." The audience was still buzzing as we stepped down from the stage. I caught fragments of conversation as we passed, words like fraud, impossible. She proved it. And what happens now? Cameras followed us, the flashes leaving ghost shapes in my vision. Victor stayed where he was, standing rigid at his table, watching us go. His expression wasn't rage, it was something colder. A calculation that told me this wasn't over. Outside, the cold night hit like a plunge into seawater. The rain had started again, light but steady, dotting the pavement with silver rings. The SUV was waiting at the curb, engine running, warmth spilling from its open door. We slid inside without a word. The door shut, sealing the sound of the gala behind us. The city moved past in streaks of wet light, the hum of the tires on the road a steady counterpoint to the thudding in my chest. Grant was the first to break the silence. "It's done." I looked at him. "You think that's the end?" "No," he said, his gaze fixed on the windshield. "But it's the beginning of his end, and that's enough for tonight." We drove the rest of the way in silence, not the kind that weighs heavy, but the kind that feels earned, the kind that comes when you've walked into the fire and out the other side still standing. Somewhere between the port and the high-rise, I realized my hands had stopped shaking. By morning, the story was everywhere. My phone lit up with messages, journalists wanting statements, old friends I hadn't heard from in years asking if it was really me on the stage. Headlines carried my name alongside Victor's, the words forgery, exposed, and ink scandal flashing across every news feed. I was skimming an article when my phone rang. The caller ID made my chest tighten. Mom. Maya. Her voice was warm but trembling, like she'd been holding back tears all morning. I saw you. On the news. I can't believe you stood there in front of all those people. I smiled, even though she couldn't see it. I just told the truth. You did more than that, she said. You stood up to him. I'm proud of you, sweetheart. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I'd been chasing that feeling, her pride, without realizing how much I needed it. How are you feeling? I asked finally. Better today, she said. Better knowing my daughter doesn't let anyone take what's hers. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of the guest room for a long time. The storm outside had cleared, leaving the bay under a pale winter sun. I could see the cranes in the distance, frozen in place like they were listening. Grant found me downstairs later. Come on, he said. I want to show you something. We walked down to the docks, the air cold and clean. The water lapped gently against the pilings, carrying the faint scent of salt and diesel. The city stretched behind us, but out here, it felt smaller, less pressing. He stopped near the end of the pier, where the view opened wide to the bay. When I started this, he said, it was all about taking Victor down. I wanted him ruined. Nothing else mattered. And now? I asked. Grant leaned on the railing, eyes on the horizon. Now I think it's about what comes after. You can burn a man's empire to the ground, but if you don't build something better in its place, the same kind of rot just grows back. I thought about his father's mural, the fragment that had survived. About how sometimes you couldn't rebuild the whole wall, but you could save enough to remind people of what was worth protecting. You're talking about the shipyard, I said. He nodded. And other things. People he's pushed out. Businesses he's gutted. There's a chance to put some of it right. The wind off the water lifted strands of my hair, carried the smell of the bay between us. Then maybe that's the real victory, I said. Not just proving he's a liar, but making sure no one else has to go through what you did. Grant's gaze met mine. Exactly. For a while, we stood there without speaking, watching a freighter ease its way toward the harbor. The gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp in the cold air. It felt like the first day in months that wasn't defined by running. From debt, from fear, from a man who thought he could own me. When we turned back toward the city, I felt lighter. Not because the fight was over, it wasn't, but because for the first time, I believed in what could come next. That evening, we found ourselves back in the research room. The city was awash of gold and silver through the glass, the harbor lights blinking like patient beacons. Grant had cleared a section of wall near the mural fragment, just an expanse of pale plaster, empty and waiting. This was where the rest of my father's mural would have been, he said quietly. I kept the space open, never knew if it was for restoring it, or just remembering what we lost. I stepped closer, my fingers brushing the cool surface. There were no cracks, no layers of paint to peel back, just the blank, honest truth of it. After weeks of staring at something that hid its lies in perfection, this openness felt almost disarming. Grant stood beside me, hands in his pockets, his reflection merging with mine in the glass. You've got the eye for this. If you wanted, we could start something here. Not to replace what was, but to build on it. I looked at the mural fragment on the opposite wall, the weathered boats, the dock, the slice of sky that had survived. The thought of adding to it, of letting something new grow alongside what had endured, stirred something I hadn't felt in a long time. "You'd trust me with that?" I asked. He didn't look away. "I already have." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sounds from the harbor carried up through the glass, the low groan of a ship's engine, the distant clang of metal against metal, the faint voices of workers finishing their shifts. The room felt suspended between past and future. I took a slow breath, imagining what could take shape here. Not just paint, but the story behind it. Layers of truth, of rebuilding, of refusing to let the walls around us be defined by someone else's design. "This," I said finally, letting my palm rest flat against the plaster, "is just the first stroke." Grant's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but something close. A small, knowing curve, as if he understood I wasn't talking only about the wall. Outside, the harbor lights shimmered against the water, their reflections stretching toward us like long, steady brush strokes. The city beyond them was still the same, loud, unyielding, unpredictable. But for the first time in a long while, I felt ready to stand in front of it, paint in hand. We stayed there until the light in the bay softened into the deep blue of night, the empty wall before us and the whole of it still to come. And I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something neither of us could yet name.